Okay, so one of the main reasons why people reject compatibilism of any sort is worries about manipulation. And of course, the basic structure of the manipulation argument is first to present a scenario in which someone is manipulated in such a way that intuitively we think she is not morally responsible in virtue of the kind of manipulation in question. And then the second step is to say there's no difference, no principled difference between that scenario and an so-called ordinary case under causal determination. And the conclusion is no responsibility even in an ordinary case under causal determination. Different people run the argument differently, and it's, I also want to distinguish, I think it is helpful to distinguish initial design arguments from manipulation arguments, although I think, yeah, for many purposes we don't have to be strict about the distinction, but analytically at least I think there is a distinction between worries stemming from initial design and worries from, as it were, hands-on or direct manipulation. Now, I would say Al Mealy's zygote argument is an initial design argument. So what he imagines is that some goddess, Diana, knowing that the world is causally deterministic and having, you know, enough knowledge and power, she creates a zygote, or she creates, right, a zygote which is such that she knows that it will, when it develops into a person, commit a certain kind of murder, and she does it intending that the individual in question commit that murder, but she also does it in such a way that the individual meets all the compatibilist, friendly conditions for acting freely. And Mealy's intuition is that it's at least not clear that Ernie, the individual she creates, is morally responsible when he does the act. But what's crucial to this argument is that Ernie is set up in this way by Diana with the intentions that she has in a deterministic world. But she doesn't have hands-on manipulation. She's not stimulating his brain or applying subliminal advertising or any kind of unconsented to manipulation. Rather, she just sets him up that way. So I think it's an initial design argument. Sometimes it's called a manipulation argument. And of course, in Pereboom's four-case argument, one of the cases is, I think, relevantly similar. Case 2 is very similar to Diana and the initial design. There's no, as it were, direct or hands-on manipulation in case 2. In case 1, there is. In any case, we're looking at manipulation arguments. Let me just say a little bit of background. In my own work, in my book, The Metaphysics of Free Will, I started with a number of thought experiments involving scenarios of manipulation. And, you know, I talked about a nefarious neurosurgeon who secretly manipulates someone's brain in intuitively a way that eliminates responsibility. And I had a number of scenarios like this from the literature and so forth. I talked about Carl Genet's example of an amusement park ride where, you know, there are rides, probably not in this particular amusement park, but there are rides that simulate, they make it appear as though the customer is controlling the car. Everything is simulated in such a way as to induce the experience of control. But it turns out the car is on a track and the car is actually not in your control. And what I asked was, if causal determinism were true, would we all be like the individual in that ride, or the individual who's being manipulated by the evil scientists? And my overall strategy was to say, in one way, we would be all like those creatures. That is, we would all lack freedom to do otherwise. If, you know, granting the consequence argument, we would all be like those manipulated individuals and lacking regulative control. But it's important, as you know, to distinguish guidance from regulative control, and I would say the manipulation cases are cases in which there's no guidance control, but you can't extrapolate that to causal determination. That was my overall strategy in the metaphysics of free will. And then in responsibility and control, my co-author and I gave a fuller, more complete, more comprehensive account of guidance control. But the basic idea is this, that not all causal chains are created equal. Not all deterministic chains are created equal. They don't all equally rule out acting freely, even if they all equally rule out freedom to do otherwise. And my claim would be, in the cases that are intuitively problematic for moral responsibility, you won't find guidance control. But that, of course, does not, in my view, extrapolate to causal determination itself. And so that's been, you know, a central, I mean, manipulation worries have been a central driving force in my work. And I do think that the best strategy is to kind of take a finer grained or more granular look at cases and try and explain our intuitions about lack of responsibility in a way that's not stronger than we need. Because in my view, let me just say, of course, wrecking all the suspense here, in my view, Pereboom's mechanism for explaining the intuitions and his intuitions in the cases is too strong. It's not required to explain our intuitions in the cases. And it does get the incompatibilist result, but that's because it's really too strong and doesn't really make the nuanced discriminations that we want. So what he says is, when our behavior is produced by factors, let's put it this way, when our behavior is produced by factors that can be, that are out of our control, then we're not morally responsible. Or when you can trace back in the causally deterministic chain to factors beyond one's control, the chain that issues in one's behavior, then one's not morally responsible. And that would, of course, imply that Plum is not morally responsible in any of the four cases. But in my view, that's using a sledgehammer where you don't really need a sledgehammer. All you need is a little ordinary hammer. And I'll explain. Okay, that's kind of the background. Any comments or questions so far? Okay, so maybe what we should just do then is talk directly about the four-case argument. Let's just make sure. Okay, it's on page 76. And there are all cases where Professor Plum kills White, an innocent person, but it turns out that the ways in which this happens are different in the four cases. Case 1 on 76, a team of neuroscientists has the ability to manipulate Plum's neural states at any time by radio-like technology. This particular case, they do so by pressing a button just before he begins to reason about a situation, which they know well will produce in him a neural state that realizes a strongly egoistic reasoning process. The idea is Plum, like all of us, has some dispositions toward egoism, some dispositions toward altruism, and what this manipulation does, this direct stimulation of the brain, is it enhances or strengthens the inherent tendency toward egoism. I mean, I think, let me back up for a second. manipulation, just qua manipulation, is presumably not problematic. So if someone had a chip in my brain and somehow was able to stimulate peripheral cells in my brain, a few cells that don't play any role in my deliberations, that would be, I suppose, manipulation. That would be direct stimulation of my brain, but it wouldn't be problematic, I assume. I mean, no one would worry about that. But, you know, so you have to be more explicit or specific about the kind of manipulation at issue. It's not just tampering with the brain or anything, it's tampering in certain ways. Here, what you're doing is increasing the strength of the already existent tendencies toward egoism. But as I understand it, although, well, let me just read it so I get it exactly right. So again, the team of neurosciences know that the manipulation will produce in him a neural state that realizes a strongly egoistic reasoning process, which the neuroscientists know will deterministically result in his decision to kill White. Plum would not have killed White had the neuroscientists not intervened. Okay. But now what Pereboom wants to say is the conditions identified by prominent compatibilist accounts of acting freely are all met. You know, the conformity of the second order volition to the first order desire, blah, blah, blah. He says, process of deliberation from which the decision results is reasons responsive. Note, by the way, he says the process is reasons responsive. He doesn't talk about ownership here, just reasons responsive, which is key, I think. All right, so he concludes, in Plum's case, in case one, Plum's action satisfies each of the compatibilist conditions, but intuitively he is not morally responsible. Okay, so then what he does, of course, is he presents a series of other cases which he says do not differ intuitively in any relevant sense, any sense relevant to Plum's moral responsibility. Case 2 is like Ernie, I think. Plum is just like an ordinary human being, except that a team of neuroscientists programmed him at the beginning of his life so that his reasoning is often but not always egoistic and so forth. So I think this is relevantly similar to Diana and Ernie. Maybe it's a little different. I mean, we're not talking about designing a zygote, but here we're talking about neuroscientists implanting a program. But it sets him up in advance to have certain strong tendencies, which the programmers know deterministically will result in the act that they want him to do. And then case 3 is ordinary human being, except that the training practices of his community causally determined the nature of his deliberative reasoning processes so that they are frequently but not exclusively rationally egoistic, etc. So first case is direct manipulation. Second case, pre-programming. Third case, training and upbringing. And they're all supposed to issue in the same kind of desire that deterministically results in the act. And then finally, case 4, everything that happens in our universe is causally determined by virtue of its past states together with laws of nature. Plum is an ordinary human being, raised in normal circumstances. And again, his reasoning processes are frequently but not, okay, so it's just an ordinary case. So again, this has the structure, or some might say the stigmata, but the structure of a manipulation case. You start with a case that elicits or is supposed to elicit the no responsibility intuition. Then you present cases where you think there's no difference and you get to the conclusion. All right, so and he goes on to talk reflect a little bit about how to understand these arguments exactly. And I think, I mean, he refers to some of Patrick Todd's work, which I think is interesting though I disagree with some of what Patrick says, Certainly, Patrick himself is an incompatibilist and a proponent of the manipulation arguments. And although I take manipulation arguments very seriously, I don't necessarily agree with them. But I think some of the method, I mean, there is a big question as to how to understand the dialectic here, what exactly is going on. And we can get into some of that. But let me just stop then and ask you, let's discuss the four-case argument. Like, at first, just clarifications or basic points, but then I want to know what you think is the problem or whether you think there is no problem. And for those of you who, I mean, I don't presuppose that you had a chance to look at my review article. If you did, you can ask me about, but I can also explain in a little while what my response would be. But okay, Matt.
Oh, yeah, it's probably maybe important to discuss the relationship between this version of the four-case argument and the version you get in Living Without Free Will.
Yeah.
He's made some adjustments to it.
Do you want to mention them? The first case is different, importantly.
I talked about Joe and Shai about this on the, I think you made a point about it on the ride up, and you did last night. Maybe we can talk about that.
Okay, so as I recall,
yeah, there's this passage on the 76.
And the first version was just like a meat puppet, basically, and it was
he didn't seem to satisfy. He
Right.
didn't seem to satisfy agency conditions.
right, so there are certain kinds of manipulation where you'd say the individual's not an agent at all, not even acting. And I think that was the reaction that many of us had to the first version of the case. But now he's trying to adjust it using a suggestion from Seth Shabo, where he's intuitively, he is an agent. It's just that, and so episodically, not all the time, but episodically, he's manipulated. And the manipulation doesn't issue in something that phenomenologically presents itself as irresistible or anything like that, or overwhelming, so that, again, you might worry that that wouldn't really be agency, although that's kind of contentious, but supposedly this way of putting the manipulation makes us think, yes, Plum is an agent, he's not stampeded or overwhelmed, he's not always manipulated. So that's supposed to be the...
But insofar as he's coming closer to satisfying these agency conditions, the intuition that he's not morally responsible is less likely to be elicited.
Right. So, as you know, I think one thing that I've said, and let me just be quite upfront about this. I think in thinking about this four-case argument and the initial, the initial design argument, the zygote argument, I think I have said different things. I've had different reactions over the course of my career. Maybe they don't fit together consistently. But one thing I've said is it's not at all clear that Plum's not morally responsible, even in case one. And again, I distinguish between responsibility and whether we should blame him. And if the desire is not irresistible and he meets the conditions, he's reasons responsive, and it's his own. Remember, Derk unfortunately just elides that, or he just talks about reasons responsiveness, not ownership. But in any case, yeah, if he meets all those conditions and the desire is not overwhelming or irresistible, then I think he could be responsible. Now then there's a further question of whether he's blameworthy or whether we should blame him. So that's one thing I've said. That's the so-called hard-line approach that McKenna has also defended. But Yishai, did you have something?
Just something about the earlier version of case one.
Yeah, okay, and then we'll get to Sophia. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so I was thinking that if compatibilist accepts non-historical sort of compatibilism, then it might be in Pereboom's interest to maintain the earlier version of case one, where we have a stronger intuition that Plum is not morally responsible. The worry, obviously, with the earlier case is that maybe Plum isn't an agent, but I was thinking that with, insofar as we're concerned with non-historical accounts of compatibilism, if we can have Plum in both the early case one and the latter case one, such that they're intrinsic duplicates of one another, then it doesn't really matter, it seems to me, how many times Plum in the earlier case is induced from moment to moment, so long as they're intrinsic duplicates.
So to explain this more, okay. In other words, Plum, in the first case, in the first version of the argument, where did he first present it? In his article, Determinism al dente? I think that might be. He has an article, Derk Pereboom, called Determinism al dente, where I think he presents this. Then he presented it in the book. What was the first book called? Living Without Free Will. How could I forget that? It's part of what I call the Living Without series. You could imagine living without ethics, living without epistemology, living without aesthetics, living without free will. Okay, but in that, there he talked about kind of a systematic, hands-on manipulation that was throughout Plum's life, right? I mean, it was more global. And I think it might matter whether he's an agent at all, might depend on whether that manipulation took place right from birth or whether it didn't, and then later on, after he had already been an agent, whether it now happens. I'm not sure. But yeah, but now in this case, it's episodic, it's not ongoing, and it's explicit that the urge that's implanted simply enhances or strengthens antecedently existing desires. But so now, what is your argument about the intrinsic duplicates?
So if Plum in the early case one and the latter case one are intrinsic duplicates of one another, sorry, I was talking earlier about a historical condition, but I guess when I think of compatibilists that reject any sort of historical condition for responsibility, I guess I would have thought that they would also want to accept some kind of intrinsic version of compatibilism, where the idea is you don't have to look outside of the agent, basically, to see whether or not the agent's morally responsible. You just look at the mechanism and so on. So the thought was, if we can have these two Plums being intrinsic duplicates of one another, and if we think intuitively Plum is an agent in the latter case one, then intuitively Plum is an agent in the earlier case one, at least if one rejects, it doesn't accept a historical condition for responsibility.
You could try and run that kind of argument. It seems like you might, if you're worried about whether he's an agent, historical considerations might be important. You might not just think that agency is a time slice notion. But it's interesting. Yeah, that would be a way of trying to really what I think you're suggesting is you could start with that initial version, and then, so that could be case zero, and then case one could be this version, and then you could say they're really not different because of that. But I mean, you'd have to buy into a non-historical approach to responsibility and agency. Yeah, Sophia?
Yeah, okay, I'm going to make one comment about that first before I get to my comment. Yeah, I think the problem I had, at least, with, I mean, I'm like attracted to ahistorical conditions, but in the way the case was originally described, it sounded as if there is only one person rather than two. It's the scientist, and he has a meat puppet to play along with, but there is no separate Plum. There is no Plum separate from the scientist. So I felt that in that situation it would be perfectly okay to, launch blame at Plum. The scientist is like listening through his ears, so the scientist is going to hear it, but there is no like separate Plum entity, and and a lot of people have that problem. And
Right. It's kind of almost like in Dan Dennett's Where Am I paper, where the locus of control is distal. It's not right there. Like you can it's like, you're right, a meat puppet, or the body is being controlled by the mind somewhere else, and now the scientists. Yeah, but now he's tried to change. I mean, we have to give him credit. One of the things I give him a lot of credit for is reading other people's work, especially criticism of his views, and trying to take it into account honestly. I mean, that's a virtue, a big virtue that not all philosophers have. You know, some of the really famous ones and great ones, I would say Harry Frankfurt is a good example of someone who really doesn't care that much about critical work and doesn't, maybe he reflects on, and I would just say Gary Watson's critique in 1975 of Harry's 1971 paper is something that Harry Frankfurt took very seriously and so forth, but he doesn't read widely and he just kind of goes in his own way. Derk has the virtue of really seriously seeking to accommodate critical work. Okay.
Yeah, but anyway, I think your response to Derk is like really strange, because okay, we've discussed before how moral responsibility and blameworthiness might come apart, but my intuition is still that if they come apart, it's got to be because something either affects the agent's difficulty in doing the right thing, like you could be less blameworthy if doing the right thing takes a super huge effort, or something affects the agent's knowledge of what the right thing is, so it's difficult for the agent to know, or something affects the wrongness in itself, so it becomes less wrong. There may be strong countervailing moral reasons and stuff. It's got to be something like that. But there's nothing like this going on here. You just say that blameworthiness and moral responsibility might come apart, so Plum isn't blameworthy in the first two cases, but is still morally responsible. I think what Derk's response should be, it should be like, okay, in that case, fine, he's morally responsible. You can have your moral responsibility, which is apparently completely disconnected from praise and blame. I don't care about that kind of moral responsibility. I care about moral responsibility that is connected to praise and blame. Apparently you agree that we shouldn't blame him in the first two cases. Well, then we shouldn't blame him in the third or the fourth case either. Let's discuss that instead. I think that is what Derk's response should be.
Okay. So what you're thinking is strange is the response I just sketched, not the response, the other response that I did in my review. So what you want to say? Yeah,
it was the response here in this book on page 89.
Right. I mean, so that's good. We'll get to the other, the one I'm now inclined toward as well.
But you mentioned this response before.
Okay, but let me just say what I think when like I say, with regard to the hardline response, the idea that Plum is morally responsible in case one, I do want to say, so in that case, the desire that's been inculcated is not irresistible. That is, it's not of a strength that's such that desires of that strength in general can't be resisted. So what I would say is but it is in fact very strong, apparently, and that's the intuition that he's not responsible might come from the fact that it is a strong desire. But what I want to say is perhaps that it's unreasonable to expect agents to resist desires of that intensity, and that is precisely, the reasoning that goes in, or that's relevant to whether the agent is blameworthy. It's unreasonable to expect Plum to resist an urge that's that intense, though agents can resist. Now, of course, it's complicated because I want an actual sequence theory, so I'd have to translate what I said into, not presupposing alternative possibilities.
Shouldn't you say then that, it's like it's murder, okay? So if your impulse isn't completely resistible, it's murder, you should resist it. But okay, let's say just for the sake of argument that he should only have a little bit of blame because the impulse was strong. Shouldn't that go through all the four cases? Shouldn't you say it? Because when he is determined, presumably he also has a strong impulse. These things are not supposed to change between the cases, right? So shouldn't you say throughout all of the cases that, we should only blame him a little bit because it's hard to resist your egoism? And
that's a good point. You're right. On that view, what I would have to say is that it's not simply the difficulty of resisting, it's the way in which it was put in place by a manipulator. So I agree that that's a question that would then remain for someone who takes the hardline approach. That, in other words, that's a good point. That what I say is, now, again, in a deterministic world, just in, like I say, an ordinary deterministic world in which everything else has to be held fixed, so the intensity of the desire is held fixed. One wants to know why the agent is egoistic in that way, okay? Why does he have such a strong desire to be egoistic? And if you can trace back to manipulation, so maybe what let me just say, perhaps what I would have to do if I wanted to defend the hardline approach, and what I want to do later is explain what I argue in my review, which is not a version of the hardline case. In my review, I say perhaps Plum is not responsible in the first case, okay? But if, and I think I have the resources to make that argument, but if I wanted to dig in my heels and say, yes, Plum is responsible, then you're right, I could not explain why we wouldn't blame him in case one by simply invoking the difficulty. It would have to be the difficulty of resisting and together with the circumstances in which it was inculcated. Now, let me just say, in a deterministic world, just qua determinism, where there is no secret implantation of desires, one might have these desires that are difficult to resist because one has formed one's character in ordinary circumstances in such a way that one is just a bastard or, is egoistic. And in that kind of case, I think you could, even though it would be difficult to resist that urge, your responsibility, as it were, traces back to a set of actions over your life by virtue of which you have that character. So I do think there is an intuitive difference there, but I should just say, you've probably noticed this, and I've admitted it too, that on my approach, I have a relatively simple, clean account of the control condition for moral responsibility. But then there's a lot of messiness and complexity in the blameworthiness part, where now I don't have a clean, neat account of blameworthiness. I admit that. But let me, I know Dimitri wants to...
Go ahead now.
Well, first comment is actually related to our yesterday's discussion on the manipulation argument, and Oksana's interesting observation about the authorities.
Yes.
I thought about it this yesterday, and I thought that this is indeed a very different case than the authorities problem, because in the authorities problem, a heap of sand is actually a multitude or a lot of sand.
Yes.
So you can clearly see how you get one particle of sand and a second and a third, and you can actually go from little to a lot. So, but in the manipulation argument, it's totally different, because you have nothing and then everything. When we are talking about sorties, it's the differences in the heap of sand is a lot of sand. It's synonymous to a lot, to let's say a million, or a lot of sand. Now, 1 grain of sand is not a lot, but it's something. So by adding something to something, you can get a lot. But by adding nothing to nothing, you cannot get something. So I think that's what takes these two, the sortie problem, manipulation argument apart.
Yeah, ex nihilo nihil fit is you can't get something from nothing, but it's it's not just that you start with nothing, but then you're adding nothing.
Then you're adding nothing as well.
And so if you're adding nothing to nothing, you get nothing. If you add a tiny bit to something, you can get something that's a tiny bit bigger. And I think Dan's point was you keep adding. Let me just, I promise I'll get to you right away, Artum, but let me just.
I do have three.
You have another question too? Okay, okay.
Question.
Okay.
That was the first observation.
Okay, but let me also just, sorry to make this somewhat self-referring digression, but I want to at least write down the name of the article that I wrote that I think people might be interested. If you're interested in the relationship between the four-case and the Sorites, I give an analysis of the trolley and its relationship to the Sorites. It's called, what? The trolley, trolley and the Sorites. Something like that. The trolley problem and the Sorites, or the trolley and the Sorites, in the Yale Journal of Law and Humanities. Okay, so you might, if you're interested, now, it was a long time ago, that was in the mid-'80s, but what I wanted to do is, I think I did argue, see, great minds think alike, Dan. I think what I argued was, in the cases where it's permissible to use this kind of reasoning with multiple cases and you're clean, and then you use transitivity, in those cases what you're really saying is there's absolutely no difference. But in the Sorites, what's really going on is you're changing something in a tiny way that is relevant, so there's a tiny difference. And that's really what explains why the Sorites reasoning is problematic, but the trolley reasoning isn't. And I'd say the same thing about the four-case argument. Okay, sorry.
Looks like you're able to download that whole paper for free. Just follow the title on the first link.
Super. Okay.
Okay, so just a brief comment, another brief comment on the bigger question.
Okay.
So after reading your review, I mean, we did cover a lot of the points in the review yesterday, and some of the comments. But I personally find the two notions problematic is the notions of evidence and the notions of ownership.
Yeah.
They're not. I don't think that they're fully explained in this review.
Yeah.
I do understand that you rely heavily on those, and I agree that Derk is not really referring to these particular issues.
Right.
He just kind of missed it. But I think that. And maybe it's the burden on him to explain, you know, to at least address those issues. But I think that he would address them definitely more if you explain them in more detail, maybe.
Sure.
So that's the comment. But the more basic question that I have, more methodological, I guess. And I thought about the manipulation argument. I was really again questioning this thought experiment method again. My concern was how far away from the realities can you go in order, can you, is this possible in the thought experiments to say, well, you can definitely change the, go ahead and imagine how science can be, what the science can do in future. But can you really actually alter the laws of, say, psychology, or the laws of biology, or the laws of physics? So if I don't think that even the agent that we have in the first case can be such a strange creature, and then maybe even to get him, you would get to you would have to break some of these I don't know, psychological laws, and maybe you'll have to, this will be a handicapped person, and maybe even in the second case, you will get a very, very strange individual that could not probably survive. Maybe this guy would die the first day he's born, or maybe he'll die when he's 14 because he'll just he'll kill he will not be able to kill Plum. He'll kill the Mr. Apple, and he'll get to the jail. Or maybe he'll kill him himself. Like, how would you know that this person...
A murder-suicide. He'll kill Plum. Derk didn't tell the story. Someone's going to write an article. The rest of the story. No, I'm sorry.
But isn't it conceivable that guy would not survive till the point he'll meet Plum?
Okay, good. So you raise a general question that I think is excellent but hard to answer, and then a more specific question about this. I mean, I think more specifically I think your worry might, I mean, it might depend on how frequently the intervention takes place. I mean, I think what Derk might say, and I forget exactly the details of Seth Szabo's article to which Derk is referring, but it might be that this is the only intervention that ever occurs, you know, in Plum's life. He's just an ordinary human being like us, and he's egoistic like all of us to some degree, and presumably everyone in this room has some tendency toward egoism, but then maybe we have different degrees of it. But that in this particular case, that's enhanced in Plum's case, but no other, you know, so maybe that worry about the psychological health of an individual is diminished by that. But I agree with you that if they're frequent, if someone were subject to frequent manipulations, that even if they didn't present themselves, I mean, maybe especially if they didn't present themselves as obvious that the individual is being manipulated, you might wonder, what's happening here? You know, there'd be a kind of discontinuity that might lead to psychological impairments. I don't know, but the general question, like when we're doing a thought experiment, what are we allowed to change about the world? I don't have. Other people can try and answer. I don't have an answer to that. And the general rule I think should be change as little as possible in order to make your point, and that as things get more and more fantastic and different from the real world, our intuitions are less and less secure or reliable, and that we should be extremely careful about that. I think think about the great thought experiments. They go back to Plato, at least to Gyges' ring, where Plato in the Republic said, you know, he tried to argue that justice is its own reward. Justice pays. It will always be in your interest, suitably understood, to be just. And then he said, you know, but what if you could wear this ring of Gyges that would make you invisible, so you could steal things, you could sleep with the king's wife and not be caught and steal things? Why shouldn't you do that? You could get away with it. And, you know, it's like the problem of free ridership or, you know, secretly not doing cheating on your income taxes if you think you can get away with it. And what he tried to argue that even so it would disrupt your soul and in the long term not be good for you. But it was this thought experiment, and and then you can go through to Descartes' evil genius thought experiment, and you know, all the different great thought experiments which I can't rehearse, but you know, in contemporary philosophy and ethics, you get the trolley problem, and Judith Thompson's famous violinist case where she's talking about abortion, and you know, the thought experiments about twin earths in philosophy of mind, and in free will you get Harry Frankfurt's you know, cases. And so what are you going to make of all these? They all involve departures in certain ways from reality. And then, I guess I'd like to hear what others think, but I don't have, I mean, one thing I think you have to be really careful about is changes in the natural laws. That, you know, if you say, well, what would happen if things started flying faster than the speed of light? Or, you know, so once you start departing from the natural laws, it seems like it's really hard to reliably know what would happen. Another thing, but you know, obviously David Lewis thinks we can think about scenarios with different natural laws and slight miracles. But I think also if morality is different, like, I mean, one thing is, what would be right if pain didn't feel the way it did in our world, or if morality were different, if people didn't have rights, certain basic rights or interests. When you're changing the laws of nature, or you're changing fundamental things about us like pain or suffering or consciousness, what if people weren't conscious or whatever? Then I think, wow, it's really unreliable. Our intuitions are unreliable. But holding fixed all the natural laws, fundamental features about us, our pain, our consciousness, and morality, holding all that fixed and imagining slight changes in the configuration of the world, you know, I think those are less problematic. That's all I can say. Matt, did you have?
I did, but did you have a third? Was that?
No, that's
or you want to focus
the authorities problem.
Okay.
The problem of evidence and
oh yeah, ownership. I want to get to that.
I think we'll discuss that.
Yeah, I'll get to that in a few minutes more. Yeah.
So I wanted to make.
Yeah.
So one immediately related to what you were talking about is I want to know if it's not just if it's a single manipulation or it's one in a series of manipulations, but whether or not it's permanent. If the effects are permanent, it really changes my judgment about the situation, because there are all kinds of ways of becoming a bad agent, and all of those ways will ultimately, I assume, since I'm not an agent causalist, I assume that all of those ways of becoming a bad agent ultimately ground out in things that the agent didn't choose.
But do you think it's possible? Do you think that this will? Well, imagine the situation. You have been, you know, some of the neuroscientists try to manipulate you and make you an egoistic person, and then you meet this love of your life. You see a person, she's so pretty. She is, you know, so smart, and she's got this elegance and everything, and she comes in and says, "What's your name?" And you know, and you're so egoistic and stuff, but she says, "How do you feel?" Right. You know, I see this sadness in your eyes, and this thing goes on, and then she says, "My name is Mr. Plum," you know, and this, I was like, yeah, I just had a surgery, and I had this new insight about my life, and would you like go and stab her in the throat? It's like, is that what you're gonna do? I mean,
if I'd been disposed to kill.
But is the point that Plum is now a new person and you shouldn't judge her from what the old Plum did, or is that the point? Is the point that Plum is a new agent now and shouldn't be judged for the old stuff?
Mr. Plum changed her sex, and you know, now he's a different person. He likes the, and you're like, what did the neurosurgeons did? I mean, they encouraged your egocentrism, but you're now in love with Mr. Plum. What is the, and how's the neurosurgeon knew that?
So this may be related to another point that I wanted to ask about. So it says that the desire to kill Plum conforms with his second-order desire. So that means that when he reflects on his desire to kill Plum, he endorses that from a higher perspective. Yeah. So you wonder, well, is that also part of the? Is that also induced? So is this a more? So another question you want to ask is this a really precise manipulation, or is it a more global manipulation? Because what you might think is to actually get these actions, especially if they're more or less disconsonant with a person's character. To get these actions, you're going to have to manipulate more than just this really specific thing. But if you manipulate more of the agent, then I'm going to be more inclined to see him as responsible. Yeah. But I'm going to ask John a question. So you said something like, well, look, character formation traces, well, so you have this ability to control your character, and if you control it in certain ways, you're going to be blameworthy for acting on your character. But as I said earlier, it seems like all your exercises of agency in forming your character are going to be explicable or going to ground out in stuff that you didn't have any control over.
Absolutely.
So why not just cut it out and say it doesn't matter where your character came from. It doesn't matter if you formed it and that gets explained by stuff you didn't have any control over, or if it was formed by manipulators. Well, you want to resist that latter conclusion. I don't quite see the motivation.
Well, intuitively, I think it does matter how the character gets formed. I mean, I think if you're an egoist, but you've had what I call the Leave It to Beaver childhood. In other words, there's a show called Leave It to Beaver. How many of you have actually seen that? Oh my God. Yeah. Okay, well, it's just, all right, that's my age is showing again, but yeah, that was staple, but Leave It to Beaver. But it was this kind of middle class, 1950s, 60s family, relatively well affluent, and there wasn't abuse, emotional abuse. There was the usual challenges of life, you know, the cat that got stuck on the tree and, you know, and how to get it down, all the things that, you know, in that kind of relatively favorable environment. But then you then form your character. And what's important is you filter your experiences through your normative structures and framework. And so you have experiences, you learn from them, you kind of compare your experiences to your principles that you accept. Sometimes it's explicit, sometimes it's implicit, but over time you form your character in this way. I think that's just fundamentally different from having your character implanted by a manipulator, and our intuitions about blameworthiness might flow from that. But I mean, also I think if you don't make a distinction like this, then you have the problem, then a hardliner has the problem Sophia raised, that is, if you say no blameworthiness or no all things considered blame, in the first case, then you'd have to say the same thing about ordinary determination, which I don't want to say. So I mean, anyway, I do think, you know, one article I think one of the best articles for my money on the manipulation argument is by Kristen Mickelson Dimitriou, who recently was the guest blogger on the Flickers of Freedom, but she wrote an article in Australasian Journal of Philosophy where what she argues is in the manipulation cases that are problematic, but I mean this is more the mealy line, as it were, that what's really going on that's problematic is the manipulation is bypassing the ordinary normative structures, so that, you know, even if determinism is true, presumably my experiences and observations are used, they're input to an ongoing process of critical reflection, and especially as I'm forming myself as an agent, but even throughout my life, I'm constantly kind of bringing to bear on my experiences, my normative structures, the principles I've accepted, and so forth. And then that all gets bypassed or superseded in the case of direct manipulation. I think that makes a difference.
You know, in my view, since your exercises of these agencies, since you're not ultimately responsible for those, it doesn't matter. All that matters is that you have a kind of cohesiveness, such that you're an agent, such that you have a subjective orientation that looks out into the world.
So this is, I mean, when I think you have always been very taken by worries about ultimate sourcehood, and what I would say is, right, if everything is determined, even your processing the information and comparing it to your normative principles and reflecting and adjusting on the basis, what that shows is that you couldn't have done otherwise. But since couldn't have done otherwise is not really relevant to responsibility, in my view, that's neither here nor there. And you can freely choose to adjust your orientation and your principles and your dispositions in light of observations, and that whole thing is bypassed. Well, that's what I... Okay, so Artun, I know you wanted to get in.
First I want to respond to your first comment about this heap of sand argument. Perebum wants to convince us that moral responsibility can have meanings only 1 and 0. There is a moral responsibility, or there is no moral responsibility. But I think, and I think it was also Sophia's point, that moral responsibility can change in grade. can change in grade, can
come in degrees.
Come in degrees, and so we can say that Plum has this highest degree of responsibility and blameworthiness in the fourth case, and the lowest degree of the responsibility in the first case. For example,
so you think that's a different response? Like all these responses, it's not just Pereboom, but I think all the responses, you know, they either they presuppose an all or nothing conception of responsibility. At least now.
That's what Pereboom wants to convince us, but I don't see any reasons to accept this.
But I think even Mealy and McKenna and I were, everyone who's responded, I mean, we responded in different ways. Yeah, but so that's an interesting idea.
Yeah, another thing.
But I wouldn't want to just say that. I do think blameworthiness admits of degrees, but I don't think moral responsibility does. But I wouldn't. But I do. It's one of those things I wouldn't go to the mat on, or I wouldn't. Sorry to use that expression. I wouldn't insist on it. I wouldn't insist on it. Okay, because
probably I unintentionally equated blameworthiness and moral responsibility.
But you still have to say what the morally relevant difference is between the cases. If you say that responsibility or blameworthiness is,
you're still going to have
smaller.
Right, that's true. So if you, in other words, if you say very little responsibility in the first case, little more in the second, more in the third, more in the fourth, you're going to have to explain though why, you know.
Well, I think that it's more or less possible with this manipulation. Like manipulator goes farther and further from you. Well, it's just a version. The second thing I want to say is, look, Pereboom can't insist that that manipulation is precise, as Matthew said. If manipulation is very precise, these cases don't meet compatibilists' demandings. Well, and he leaves some free space, some elbow room for Plum. What does he say? That the scientists may, in the first case, scientists make Plum to reason egoistically, but it doesn't mean that in every case. Oh no! Plum is a killer, is a murderer. Yes. Yeah. Okay. So they just make him to reason egoistically, but it doesn't mean that in every case he will decide to kill White. And
that's not an irresistible.
Yeah, and doesn't it mean that in this decision to kill White, Plum takes some considerable takes some considerable part?
Yeah.
And I will imagine a situation: any person gets drunk and drives a car. If this person drives home without any accidents, well, he or she is more or less blameworthy, but it's not very high grade of blame. And in a different situation, the person gets drunk and drives home, and according to some deterministic succession of events, he or she kills another person. So, although this succession was deterministic from the moment when she started driving a car, we would say that this person is responsible because he or she was responsible for the first got drunk. Well, that's my point.
I think you're right. I mean, insofar as the urge is not induced as an irresistible urge, what's a little tricky is if we accept the consequence argument, then in a deterministic world, agents can never do anything other than they do. So all urges will be, in that sense, irresistible. That the agent can't do otherwise. But there's another sense of irresistibly where it's a little tricky to define exactly, but what I'd say is irresistible urges in that sense present themselves phenomenologically with a force that's considerable, and we might say it's just not, one way of understanding it is not reasonable to expect an agent with the normal capacities for control to resist any urge of that intensity. That would be one way of understanding a more general notion of irresistibility. And Plum doesn't have that kind of urge, so that's part of what goes into the intuition that he can be responsible if you're a hardliner about that case. All right, Ben, did you?
Yeah, I wanted to go back to Matt's question about what Plum's like when he's not being manipulated. So I just realised now that Pereboom does actually say in the case, he says, his reasoning is consistent with his character because it is frequently egoistic and sometimes strongly so. And I was also going to bring back, so this is based on Seth Shabel's The Ego Button case. Mm-hmm. In that case, you have Natasha, who's a journalist, and she has a mix of, as Shabel says, a mix of altruistic and egoistic tendencies, which I take to mean that, you know, she has certain kind of egoistic values, certain altruistic values. Take it, Plum's meant to be the same, and so Pereboom, he makes this clear by saying that, you know, the reasoning is consistent with his character. He's a bit of a bad agent and a bit of a good agent. So, I mean, I think you said that's quite important what your judgment is. I think it's the same for me. So, for me, I can't really see why Plum in this case is not responsible. It just seems to me he is responsible. And kind of maybe one reason for that is that while he has been manipulated, it doesn't seem like the manipulation is not crucial to him acting as he does. He's already kind of he's a bad agent in relevant respects.
And presumably like, he's deliberating about
killing
already. I mean, that would make it most.
Right? There's some. It's not just the neuroscientist which made him kill. There are certain things in the environment were different. Yeah. He could have been brought to kill him. Like, right. It could have just been like he saw. I don't know. Like, I always think of like a motivational poster. Yeah. He was maybe thinking about reasoning that says like just do it, and he's like, right, I'm going to do it. And like so it looks like Plum won in that case, maybe more of a victim of maybe circumstantial luck, if that's the right type of luck. It just so happens that they're these neuroscientists, but it seems incidental that they're there. It could have been some
story. Motivational point. I mean, you run the same example when that's the intervention, so to speak.
Yeah. So nothing really seems to depend on manipulation per se, or that he's manipulated by agents with intentions. Yeah. So in other words, the way it's presented is, you know, these neuroscientists have the intention to do this, and they have bad intention. But this is what, again, when I presented these thought experiments early on in my paper, Responsibility and Control, then Dan Dennett is, you know, in Elbow Room, objected or said, at least, you know, you should be very careful because irrelevant factors might be kind of exerting an influence on our intuition. So if you just focus on these sinister people in the background with these evil intentions, that might influence you. But when you think about it, would it really matter if there's an agent, a neuroscientist manipulating you, or if it was just a computer that initiated it without a neuroscientist and there were no evil intentions? And then would it really matter? I mean, maybe you're right, maybe it just White is such that he has this tendency toward egoism, but if he happens to see a motivational poster, like, you know, an advertisement for Tony Robbins, is he the guy? Or there's a guy in America, a motivational speaker. He sees a Nike ad that says, just do it. And then suddenly that's what strengthens his egoistic desire. I mean, well, how is that any different, really, from the manipulation case?
It's not, but it's in the motivational poster case. I kind of think, well, it just is responsible. Like, it's just kind of, it's initiated something about him, but I mean, it's just a matter of luck. That could have happened to anyone. Yeah. Like, so it doesn't, like, the actual neuroscientist there.
Yeah, but I do think, by the way, that also, those considerations would weaken my claim that he's not blameworthy. But, you know, maybe I shouldn't have said that. I really don't know what the heck to say about these cases. Everything I try seems to fall apart. Yeah, okay.
This sort of case, I don't know, maybe I'm uniqueness, but I just kind of think he just really is responsible. Now, in Pereboom's 2001 version of Case 1, I agreed that he wasn't responsible. I thought it's clear there. But then I read this case and I'm like, well, actually when I read Seth Jabel's ego button case, I had the same thoughts. I'm thinking, there's no real reason for me to think they're not responsible.
And by the way, what's crucial, I just want to make sure everybody knows, in the original case, right, if your intuition is, no responsibility, but then it's unclear that he's an agent at all. And what's the significance of that? Well, if he's not an agent, then there'd be a crucial difference between that case and Case 2, and you couldn't run the no difference part of the argument. Remember, there's a no responsibility part and a no difference part. And it seems to be in tension here. I mean, if you get the no responsibility part for Case 1, then the no difference part seems weakened because he's not an agent at all, but then in Case 2, arguably he is an agent. It's an interesting,
So Szabo is trying to argue, he's trying to support the case.
No, he's in the course of the paper. He's trying to support his view of uncompromising source incompatibilism, which is the Pereboom style source incompatibilism, and he needs a counterexample to the non-historical compatibilist conditions, and he claims that this sort of case is.
And that's the name of the paper, Uncompromising Source?
Yeah.
That's the ego button.
Yeah, the ego button case. There's another little point about the 4 case argument. It's not a massive point, but in the 2001 version, so you have Case 1, and Case 2, and Case 3, and Case 4, you can kind of see how there looks like there's no relevant differences. So you have this kind of repeated manipulation, and then it's programming and then conditioning. But in this, you have ego button style manipulation, which involves an already pre-existing person being kind of sort of manipulated by pressing a button prior to their reasoning. Then in Case 2, it's programming at the start of their life. I mean, just on the face of it, those 2 cases seem quite different. So say I do think that Plum in Case 1 is not responsible, it's not immediately obvious to me that I should then think the same thing about Case 2. It looks like I should then it's not like you've just said, well, they're kind of structurally similar and we should just go, the structure is quite different.
It is different. So again, that's what happens when you adjust. That's a difficulty that you get into when you do try to accommodate criticism. Is the adjustment seems okay, but then it screws up some other part of your argument. And, it's like that, I think Nozick uses the metaphor of a bump in the rug where you put your foot down and you get this bump is down and then it comes up somewhere else, and that's really what's happening here. And that's what I say basically in my review. I say it might well be, first I say maybe Plum is morally responsible in Case 1. But then I say, let's say you have the intuition that Plum is not. Then what I want to say is now there's a crucial difference between Case 1 and Case 2. So I do agree with that. I mean, I have my own explanation. I think there's guidance control in Case 2, but arguably not in Case 1.
And character shaping, do you mention?
No, what I wanted, I mean, basically, let me explain. Okay, well, I'll get to it in a second. But Joe, did you have something?
Oh, just it's sort of in line with what Ben was saying. Just that you might have counterfactual dependence with many aspects of, in Case 1, many aspects of whether Plum actually commits a murder. So if the neuroscientist hadn't acted, then Plum wouldn't have done the thing. But if he had, but maybe if he, again, had a bad night's sleep, he might not have done the thing. Or if he was in a bad, it seems like you could have many different causes of it. And once you sort of take out, as you were talking about, once you take out the sort of nefarious people involved or something, or if he maybe he had a normal childhood, but I mean, it depends on if he really is identifying with, from a second order perspective, with these desires, then I don't know, if someone had made a really persuasive argument for why he ought to kill White or something like that, then, I mean, not even necessarily a motivational poster, or somebody just told him how horrible a person White was, or if somebody told him, that, just be spontaneous today, do what you really, I mean, but something, I mean, it seems like you could have all sorts of, so it depends on if manipulation is just sort of, it seems like there's many ways you could increase the chance of him actually acting. Some of them involve stimulating aspects of his brain, others don't, and if it's not stimulated to 100% chance.
What could the Pereboom say? I mean, he might say, well, look, I'm going to stipulate that Plum is ordinarily egoistic, but he has kind of the ordinary or normal tendencies toward egoism, and he's such that he would not, you know, that together with his additional normative principles and dispositions and character is such that if someone came and said, you know, White really is creepy, Mrs. White, you know, she's really a creepy, unattractive person, and, you know, he would still not kill her. And he wouldn't kill her over a range of counterfactual situations. It's just that he's such that if he's manipulated in this way, he would kill her. I mean, maybe, I don't know, what if someone said, look, Plum is such that even if he were to see a motivational poster, or if someone were to convince him that Mrs. White was really creepy and a drag on society and she takes welfare and doesn't work, I mean, he still wouldn't, that wouldn't be enough. It requires some kind of manipulation. Does that then make it more compelling that maybe he's not?
I'm not sure. I'm worried in those cases then, because it's supposed to be the Plum already engages in this egoistic reasoning.
Yeah.
I take it the idea is that the neuroscientists are only really supposed to be matching the kind of influence of something in his environment.
Yeah.
The Pereboom's basically just put a face on this influence, on this kind of source to make you think, well, that's, you know, that's kind of scary.
Right.
So if it's the case that only the neuroscientists, then it's not clear that it is going to be matching
It sounds like
environmental influence.
Right, this is the kind of thing he does sometimes. He sometimes has egoistic impulses like this. That seems to be the story. And so, but if you added, but in this case, he could only get it from just this sort of thing, then it seems less plausible.
It seems less likely that it's already ingrained in his character. They've kind of changed his character that way.
It's interesting. Yeah. Go ahead.
Could you also say that it's a risk that you take on by, I mean, so even if, so if he really does reflectively endorse this type of action and it accords with his character, you can say it's a risk of developing that type of character that you are susceptible to, you know, this type of manipulation, something like that, and it's sort of a matter of like moral luck. Like it's sort of in the sense.
Maybe.
It's I mean it's a bit of a stretch, but in the sense of like, it's not exactly the same as driving drunk, but in the sense that you're taking on a risk, and that's one of the bad things that can happen. It usually doesn't.
That's good. That's good. Well, I think you could make the analogy with drunk driving, where you freely drink too much, and then that puts you at risk of running over. I mean, you freely develop this character, which then puts you at risk of being exploited in this sort of way or manipulated. Yeah, Simon.
Could Pereboom say, like, could he accept the view that responsibility comes in degrees, and then he could say, well, in some of these cases we've been mentioning, like the poster, someone trying to persuade you and so on, the person's responsibility is mitigated to some degree, and then he could just, that would be as much of a problem, wouldn't it? If
maybe you could say that. Remember, he refers to
Patrick Todd's argument. We've got a paper,
okay.
What does it say about? Okay, so on page 81, it talks about Patrick Todd's 2011 paper. Todd, in addition, makes a good case that proponents of manipulation arguments have assumed too heavy a burden. They do not need to make it plausible that manipulated agents are not morally responsible, only that their responsibility is mitigated. So if what he there is suggesting is that if the manipulation argument might work by just showing mitigation, where a compatibilist would have problems explaining that mitigation.
I think probably worth pointing out another thing in the background is that maybe some people think that because the neuroscientists have caused, there are other agents causing Plum to act, that, you know, it's the neuroscientist's fault and not actually Plum's. I think most compatibilists would take the view that, you know, two people can be responsible for this kind of event. Like,
two people can be fully responsible, though not solely responsible for the same. I think Frankfurt makes that distinction. One of his famous footnotes, I think.
Just this, can I continue briefly? So he does say that Plum would not have killed White had the neuroscientists not intervened, but that must mean keeping everything the same about the environment. That's compatible with if counterfactually other changes had been introduced. I think he's going to have to admit that. He can't say, no matter, no other changes would have done it, only this change.
You shy?
Yeah, I know that, I can't remember the details, but Andrew Perry has a paper in Full Studies responding to Patrick Todd where he says there's this counter argument
against incompatibilism, and that argument is balanced with Todd's mitigation argument, and so the mitigation argument doesn't work.
Yeah, I forget that's a good point. So Andrew Curry, it's actually spelled Khoury. Andrew Curry is, I think, well, he got his PhD at Arizona State. He's been at London School of Economics. I don't know, I mean, as a visitor, I don't know where he is now.
He's still there.
Still there. So yeah, he has a reply to Patrick Todd. And Patrick, I know, is, you know, he's thinking about writing something in reply, but I don't know if he's actually gone around to it. But it's interesting. So that's another way of going, where you say, I'll run the manipulation, I'll run the four-case argument, but I won't try and show that there's no responsibility, just mitigated responsibility, and then that will be a problem for compatibilism. But then Curry has replied. I think maybe some other people have replied. Here's before we have our break, let me lay out my account, then we can think about it, and we can then, after the break, we can talk about Mealy and McKenna and these other ways of replying. Because I wasn't really convinced by some of Derk's replies to his critics. Okay, so maybe there are smiles of agreement there. But in any case, what I want to say, remember, and Dimitri's right, that I don't really say enough in my review, nor do Mark Revisa and I really say enough to have a complete defense of our account of ownership and responsibility and control. But basically this is the idea that it's not enough for the mechanism that issues in action to be reasons responsive. It has to be one's own mechanism. And specifically, we were worried about manipulation cases. That's why we added the ownership condition. That's one reason why it's a little puzzling that Derk didn't really attend to it. Although, out of fairness, one thing to point out is, and this doesn't come out too much in my review article, is in my original article, Responsiveness and Moral Responsibility, I did not add an ownership condition. And in the 1994 book, The Metaphysics of Free Will, with Blackwell, I did not have an ownership condition. In the last chapter, I said, it appears as though reason's responsiveness can be manipulatively inculcated. Therefore, in future work, I'm going to add an ownership condition, but I actually didn't do it until responsibility and control. So if Derk wrote determinism al dente before responsibility and control came out, he would not have focused on the ownership condition. And then in revising it, he might just have not gone back. And that's all fair. I mean, it's, you know, he's very admirable in reading so much, and you can't expect him to get everything. But in any case, so what I want to say is, what Mark and I want to say is, your mechanism, let's say, of practical reasoning or habit or whatever, becomes your own in virtue of your taking responsibility. You take responsibility for a mechanism when you see that, and then three conditions have to be met. The first are beliefs. You see yourself as differentially efficacious in the world when you're acting from that mechanism. Second condition, you see yourself as a fair target of the reactive attitudes in virtue of acting on that mechanism. Then, importantly, because we admitted that those beliefs could be inculcated, we say those beliefs have to be based on one's evidence in the right way. And the intuition was, if someone's just stimulating your brain to give you those beliefs, you'll still have those beliefs no matter what your evidence is. Now, of course, we realized you could have a fancy counterexample where someone actually differentially inculcates beliefs based on different evidence. So we had to say, based on your evidence in the appropriate way. And then, you know, we admit that there are problems. That's incomplete. So it's incomplete at best. And we gesture at a way of understanding appropriateness in our book, but okay, it is incomplete. But let me just say, what I want to say is, it's really not clear whether Plum is responsible in case one. But if you say he's not, that might be because you're thinking he's not acting from his own mechanism. I mean, he's being episodically and without his consent manipulate it. So it's a manipulation mechanism. In case 2, so I would not have to say he's responsible, even though he's reasons responsive, he's not responsible because it's not his own mechanism. But in case 2, and in the rest of the cases, you do have mechanism ownership as well as reasons responsiveness, and so you would have responsibility, though you might have differential blameworthiness. And that's my way of resolving it, that upon reflection, the cases, it's not obvious that the cases are all to be assimilated with regard to responsibility. Maybe in case 1, the agent's not responsible, but that wouldn't transfer to case 2. Why do I say that? Well, again, I really, I think the initial design arguments are really weak. I don't think it matters what the agent's intentions are in programming you. Does it really matter if you got that program as a result of nature or as a result of an individual? What if the individual had good intentions? It doesn't really matter what the individual's intentions are. I argue this in my paper. This is a paper that, has not met with universal agreement, but that doesn't distinguish it particularly. But this is a paper that's really controversial, but it's in analysis, my paper. The zygote argument remixed. And I just really argue, there it's an analysis a couple of years ago. And there, what I do is present a bunch of examples which I think show that it really doesn't matter what the intentions of Diana were. I mean, let's say Diana, remember, case 2, I think, is like the zygote argument, but let's say Diana creates a zygote in Mealy's formulation. It's crucial. The way Ernie was created, that's part of it. It says the zygote argument remixed, R-E-M-I-X-E-D, sorry. So in the journal analysis. So, but what if Diana created the zygote exactly the way she did in Mealy's story, but she really didn't have any specific intentions with regard to Ernie. She just did it. And if you asked, why did you do it? She said, I don't know, I just did it that way. Would that, now would he be responsible? That doesn't seem right. Or, it really doesn't matter what her intentions were. And so I'd say, think about the second Plum case. Why does it matter that neuroscientists set him up? All of us get our initial genetic endowments from the natural lottery, as Rawls famously called it the natural lottery. It's just like a lottery. And we also get our early experiences from a different, the social lottery, you could say, the family lottery. I mean, we don't choose our parents. And it just is out of our control. So how is that any different from scientists pre-programming you? I mean, I just don't see that. So that's what I would say, that you do have guidance control in the second, third, and fourth cases. Plum doesn't have it in the first case. And Pereboom misses this explanation because he focuses just on the reasons responsiveness part, not the ownership part. He does, in a footnote, admit or concede that we had this, let's see, do you remember where that footnote was? I referred to it in my review. Let's see. He does mention my ownership. So on page 87, footnote, oh God, I can't read. I'm getting too old. Footnote 9. I'm getting too old, but it beats the alternative. Fisher and Revisa hoped, so now he is referring to the 1998 book, The Responsibility Control, hoped to preclude manipulation by specifying that moral responsibility requires an agent to come to understand and accept that she is morally responsible through a reflective historical process that involves rational sensitivity to the evidence. So that's, rational sensitivity to the evidence is condition C. But since the historical reflective endorsement is a causal process. The neuroscientist can manipulate Plum to realize it. Okay, and then he also says the same is true for what Al Mealy specifies. Well, I mean, I just want to say I agree that it's not clear that the resources that we put in place, Mark Revisa and me, really work. But it's not, I mean, he just is asserting here that the whole thing can be inculcated, where what we did was we specified condition C in it and then explained it in a very long footnote in a way that we hoped would get around the manipulation words. What he's not really addressing the way we suggested. But let me just say, reasonable people can certainly feel uncomfortable or unsatisfied with our historical condition. I agree with that. But at least here's another way of thinking about the cases. Okay, let me, why don't we, okay, I will get, I think, Matt, all right, well, tell me whether you want to talk now and then take our break, or you want to take our break and save your...
Oh, I can say this afterwards.
How about you? Do you want to say something quickly now?
Sorry, I'll probably do that. I'll wait until after the
Okay,
break.
How about you?
I'm just going to invite you to metaphysical flip-flopping, so you can think about this during the break. What if you decided that your taking ownership condition didn't work, and that the relevant belief could be inculcated? Would you then accept the four-case argument, or would you accept the kind of ahistorical view that I'm...
Well, there's another possibility. I think I'd fall back on the hardline response. I wouldn't accept it, but I mean, remember, I'd fall back on the claim that he is responsible. Is that? Yeah,
but that's what. I don't know that that's.
But I try. No, yeah, it's not flip-flopping because I'm not sure. I think it might be overdetermined in a certain way that I'm not sure what to say about it. Mm-hmm. I mean, this has been. I take a certain pride in being comprehensive as a philosopher and systematic and consistent, and I must admit that over time, I haven't quite known what to say about the manipulation arguments, and so I've probably said inconsistent things. So, that's, you know, I won't be the first philosopher to have done that. But right, why don't we take? Would you like to say something quickly now?
Tiny question.
Okay.
But in the first case, he still takes his deliberations as his own.
Yeah, he definitely takes it as...
So he has the ownership.
No, okay, no, but the problem is, okay, so he might, the problem is, he might even reflect and say, I take my deliberation as my own. I kind of identify with it. The problem is, his deliberation is, he's taken responsibility for ordinary practical reasoning or deliberation, but what's really operative is a manipulation mechanism, and he hasn't taken responsibility for that. That's what I'm saying. Good point. Okay, so we'll come back at 35 minutes after the hour. Okay.